Hey there, I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Mastery. This word, in the simplest sense, straight from an Oxford dictionary, means comprehensive knowledge or skill in a particular subject or activity. It is a concept that is oh so desired by many, but achieved by so few. Why is that? Well, presumably, it involves a high degree of innate ability, athletic, intellectual, interpersonal, or unique combinations of the like, that not all are fortunate enough to possess. Other times, though, there are those who ostensibly are evenly suited as far as potential and skill goes, and yet only one of the two, or 100, or 1,000 will break through and achieve. Again, why is that? Well, our guest today has a few opinions on this based around his own experiences with mastery and elite performance. Yeah, welcome to the show. So, Seth Pepper is an elite mental performance coach. He consults and works with those who strive to get the most out of their own skills and abilities. His clients range from athletes, coaches, and teams within professional sports leagues, including, and get ready for this, the PGA, LGPA, ATP Tour, MLB, NFL, NHL, NCAA, and WTA. His methods in coaching have amounted to the capturing of championships and praise from many. Further, he also speaks to CEOs, their teams, and individuals within high performance professions and businesses. And the goal for Seth in every case is clear: accessing each person's unlimited potential. Now, Seth himself comes from the world of high performance and accomplishment. He's held sponsorship from the biggest names in sport, including Nike, due in part to his accomplishments not limited to the following: two-time national champion swimmer, 23-time All-American athlete, Pan Pacific Games gold medalist, World University Games gold medalist, university record holder in 7 events, held title of 4th fastest swimmer in the world by the age of 20. Oh, and I might add, he took up swimming when he was 14. Yeah, well past the age most proven performers do so. And according to Seth himself, it was not only his physical skill which helped propel him to such heights, but also his mental approach to it all. And it is this base experience, incorporating his own athletic journey, that he uses as a model and inspiration for his clients to pass on his own learnings and mental performance techniques. So, with all that stated, Seth, I've had this circled in the calendar for the last little while. I'm really excited for this talk. Yeah, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this as well. Yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you.
Yeah, great, great. Yeah, again, your accomplishments sort of speak for themselves. So I'm excited to get into all of this. In terms of all that, yeah, I've got the first segment lined up. It's something called Coloring Wikipedia. And as my listeners know, basically what I do here is I just read off a definition of the guest profession, sometimes their industry, what they do. And I find it's just kind of a nice jumping off point into the whole talk. Sometimes these definitions are spot on, other times they're off. As well, sometimes too, like you might hold up a title of whatever you're doing, but then somebody else who holds the exact same title puts their stamp on it in a different way, and it sort of amounts to something different. So it's just like a nice launching pad into this discussion. So with that in mind, I do have you down here for a mental performance coach, and unfortunately, Wikipedia is going to let us down here. They didn't actually have anything. There were no entries for this, unfortunately. So I did a bit of internet sleuthing, and I found a website called Peak Sports, and I did come up with a definition. So I'm just going to read that off quickly, and just within the context of all that you do, maybe you could think about that and then comment after. Does that sound all right?
Yes, sounds great.
Okay, well, here we go. Mental performance coach. Mental performance coaches teach athletes specific mental skills and strategies to improve focus, develop stable confidence, manage performance anxiety, and learn how to deal with daily challenges of being a competitive athlete. Short and sweet. First take, what do you think of that?
Yeah, it's funny because it sounds accurate. Um, my short version of all of the space that I end up working in a lot is just helping people get out of their own way. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it kind of just boils it right down to the issues, I suppose, that most people probably have, and when it comes to like mentally preparing themselves and you know putting themselves in the
mhm,
best position to succeed, it really probably is just that. It's decluttering, if anything, right? Your thoughts and maybe
mhm.
sort of emotions. Hmm. Okay, interesting. I mean, if there were anything, or was there anything you would add to the definition, or you just like to keep it as simple as that?
Well, it definitely includes a lot of other areas to that you're supporting, kind of being there. For me, I mean, I'm just speak very simple. I deal with people that are, they have a lot at, like there's a lot on the line, and it's under high pressure, and so it
Mm,
has to be something that they can go to. It's easily accessible and easy to remember.
yeah.
So a lot of times, what I learned in books didn't really serve what actually happened, out. I like to call it the battlefield, right? The
Yeah.
battlefield of performance.
Yeah.
So speaking from real life experience has really, I think, been beneficial to kind of cut through any sort of noise. So
Mm, okay.
yeah.
Have you found over the course of your career, like drawing, of course, you just referenced that, like your own experiences, I suppose, and
Mhm.
then as you've developed in the course of your career, taking ideas from perhaps science, from others that you've worked with, has that sort of been molded into what you do now? Or is it, would you say like the base still comes from your own early experiences with mastery and accomplishment?
Well, for me personally, I was always interested in this. It's just the way as a child I would watch, my mom was manic depressed my whole life. So that created a curiosity of, why am I so motivated, and why is my mom, like what's the contrast, and
Mm,
trying to understand that better. I've always been one of those people, very optimistic, always wanting to strive to be the best, and curious about people that aren't, and trying to understand the differences. And so I was always the kid trying to, convince all of us that, hey, we can jump the bike farther. Let's try it. Let's make the jump bigger. Let's think differently.
okay.
I've been like that ever since I was a little kid, and
Mm,
so that's kind of where I come from. And
huh.
I'm doing the same thing, just, doing it with adults.
Yeah. Slightly different scale here, but yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I've never really considered it that way or heard it kind of put out that way in that sense. Yeah, really, really interesting. And I know we have, or I have some questions lined up later on to kind of dig into that a little bit deeper. But before we do so, maybe
Mhm.
we can slide on over into this next segment, something called pathways. And this one kind of speaks to the point where you were just, referencing in terms of how you ended up in this profession essentially, and you just sort of spoke
Mhm.
about some of your formative experiences in childhood, but maybe there was a bit more in there as well along the way that's kind of directed you or led you down this pathway.
Definitely. I started my, whole journey as far as like sports are concerned personally. I did it out of this curiosity. I started late when I was 14, as you mentioned. So I've looked at my personal journey as being more like a mental experiment, is how I kind of have labeled it. And from that, I was able to help my brother to, I became a national champion. I helped my brother to become a national champion. He started even later. He started when he was 17.
Wow.
And so I've used this, this way of, I guess you could just say, just viewing life and going after what you really want in life. I've been, helped myself, my brother, others that are athletes, coaches, Netflix film director,
Mm,
fashion design, all kinds of people from all walks of life. As you said, CEO, coach, things like that. And it's been fascinating to be able to basically apply the understanding of performance across the board. I like to
mm,
say performance is performance, right?
yeah, yeah.
And it fits across all different types of genres.
No, that's really interesting. In terms of, I guess, your rise to, the course of what you've done and your accomplishment. Again, I kind of lightly referenced that off the top, but maybe you kind of fill in some of those gaps. I think it'd be interesting for listeners to hear a little bit more about that, and selfishly for myself as well.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so when I started, I was 14 and I had this curiosity of the Olympics. And so I sat in front, just like everybody else, in front of a TV, trying to decide which sport I was going to go after. And so I'm from a small town in Oregon, and I knew that I needed to choose a sport that I would have access to. Process of elimination, I came up with swimming. So I went to this, or I watched swimming to get to the point where someone had just won the gold medal. And I remember they were asking her, if someone out there wants to do what you just did, what would you recommend? Yeah. And once I heard that, that was the question that was in my head. I said, whatever she says, that's it. I'm going to do that. Yeah. And so she mentioned that she came through the YMCA program. So I went down to the local Y and walked up to the head coach and said, I want to go to the Olympics. Can you help me? And he kind of chuckled. And then he asked if I knew how to swim. And I said, no. And so he laughed. That was a full laugh. So I started, humble beginnings, started with like little 8-year-olds. And here I was, freshman in high school, so a lot taller, at least twice their height. And I was just learning. I didn't know how to swim. But what actually, it all works together. So what looked like a disadvantage of starting late actually became an advantage. And especially now, because a lot of times when you talk about how do people get in their own way, a lot of what's happening is that they're trying to control the results, which are a lot of times out of our control. A lot of times they have a fear of failure, right? And so when I started so late, I was in a constant state of failure. That's all it was failing all the time, but I had no other choice. So for me, I just started, processing information and getting better, learning. And so that's what I try to help people now, is change their relationship to failure and be able to become the student of whatever it is, of life, of that performance, and allow it to teach you and to really lean into failure. That, as we like to say, fail your way to the top. Yeah. So, that's been really rewarding. And so starting at 14, my dad handed me a book that was about the mind, it was about memory. They had this study in there. It was, the Germans, and they were doing this basketball research where one group was physical training only. Another group was a mix of physical and mental. And that was the first time I'd ever heard that you could actually train your mind. And I got curious. And then there was another group that didn't even touch a basketball. All they did was just the mental training. Yeah. Results came back. Physical only was the lowest. Mixed group was the highest. And then this group that didn't touch a basketball was only just a little bit below the top group. So immediately I was like, okay, so I'm going to train my mind and I'm going to train my body. So my beginning, my foundation came from, I'm going to use my mind as a sort of like X factor, right? It's just going to excel my growth. So already I was in this state of constant failure, being a student, and then now I'm going to use the mind. And from there, I was able to just, I did all kinds of things with my mind, tricking myself into believing that I was, there's this phrase or understanding that if you lie enough to yourself, you'll believe it. Right. Yeah. So I use that to my advantage. And so I was constantly convincing myself that I was faster than I was, constantly doing the mental training, constantly, messaging, all these different things. And eventually, by the time I was a senior in high school, I won the state championship. So in 4 years, I became the state champion. And then I went to the university. Yeah, that was, and it was always very, very quick, going through all this, the progression. I was constantly pushing the envelope, as I was telling someone.
To
Go
interject there, I
ahead.
think one thing that struck me right away, and you're speaking of when you join this, rewinding a bit, when you join their swimming classes at the Y, and you're this
Yeah.
14-year-old kid, and you're with these 8-year-olds essentially, and talking about failure over and over and over. Also, too, it kind of struck me that maybe once you start to get the hang of things, of course, just physically being superior, more developed and able to put things together, probably success started to come for you there as well. And maybe mentally on that side of things, like obviously, you're older than the rest of these kids, but still you start to see like, well, yeah, I can actually do this. And that sort of maybe have fed into this as well, starting to develop confidence in that sense. I don't know if I'm on
Yeah.
something there or not, but I could envision at least those types of things also, aside from just the failure, sort of like in your relationship with that, also your relationship with success, perhaps starting to develop as well, little by little. Am I on
Yeah.
anything there, or is that?
Yeah. I like the way you think. I like what you're saying. And it definitely, a lot of times when we have a lot of fear of failure initially, then once you get further along, it's interesting. It's the same coin, as I like to say. The other side of the coin is fear of success. So I was constantly pushing the envelope to be able to say, okay, well, if I did this, and just think what I could do next. And so I was constantly, I remember, guys that were on the team would say, you can't keep taking 2 seconds off every season. And my response to them was, why not? I'm the one that
We can take
decides that.
three
That's
now.
going on. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I was able to do that. I was able to, and that's what I help people with, is a lot of times, I became fascinated with the subconscious mind. As I like to say, the subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between possible and impossible, right? We're the ones that create the filter. And so I was constantly pushing that envelope. And so I would always say, and, be in this sort of state of, exploration, where it's like, well, why not? Why can't I do that? Let's see how far we can push this. And, was able to do things that people just thought were completely impossible. And so now I encourage others to do the same thing and make these quick transitions. And then I already set the stage, like someone that I helped get into the NBA. I just met him. I didn't know he was having a tryout. I could see that he had blockages.
Yeah.
So I gave him a tool that, seemed could kind of help him to go to this practice. And the practice ended up being a tryout for the NBA. And he came back and he said, I made it. I made it. And I was like, what do you mean you made it? Well, I'm on one of the top teams in the NBA.
Yeah.
And so immediately I knew that there could be this resistance to the success now. So I said, okay, well, now that you made it, if you think it's a big deal, you're only going to be there for a week, right? So we created this little mantra between us, which is, it's no big deal because you're the real deal. So that he's constantly, you got to believe that you actually, should be there. Otherwise, you will find a way to sabotage it.
Yeah.
So the relationship between fear of failure and then fear of success has been really, really interesting. Just helped someone in the LPGA to go from not winning in 12 years of being on tour to winning. And they have 4 days of competition. And so 2 days into the competition, she's in the lead by a lot. And so we've gone through fear of failure in the past. And now it's like, okay, I don't want to mess this up.
It's a whole different
So
game almost,
now,
isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, totally.
so when she reached a point where she was able to say, I've learned so much about myself through this experience. I don't care if I win or lose. Then I knew she was ready to win, and she won. So it's a strange relationship because it's a rarefied space that you're operating from. Because most people would say, "What do you mean, fear of success? What's
Right.
that?" But when you're
Exactly.
right there, and you're going to see your life dreams just sitting there,
Yeah.
that's where oh my gosh,
It's a lot of pressure right there for sure. And managing those emotions to keep producing essentially is
yeah,
it becomes a major, well, obstacle for some, or it could
yeah,
could very easily become that. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, the
I mean,
feelings they're connected to thoughts, and the thoughts, a lot of times the feelings are very blown up because you have extreme pressure, right?
mm,
So the feelings they don't make sense. They're just there. And that's what we
mm,
work through. They're just feelings, right?
yeah,
They feel really real because they're your feelings, right? But they're
right.
no more real than my feelings, right? I
Mm,
could be in the same situation and feel something opposite to you.
mhm,
So allow that feeling to be, and then follow the thought that's connected to the feeling. And a lot of times that thought, it's going to be irrational. And it could, a lot of times it's worst case scenario, catastrophizing is what we
right.
call it, right? Under this extreme pressure. And if we can navigate that, then we can get ourselves out of the way, right? And
Yeah,
just accept it.
yeah.
And
It
and
sounds like
that's
a,
when
like
we
a
get to that next level.
sounds like a degree of mindfulness, just being aware of your own thoughts. The ones that are going to be constructive, the ones that are going to kind of like take you down or deconstructive in that sense. And also too, like in just listening to what you've been explaining, it sounds as though like you yourself maybe innately have always been fairly cerebral. You'd already sort of mentioned this at a young age, noticing the relationship with your mother and some of those things on that side, the personal side, but then also your own journey, your athletic journey along the way, reading literature, listening to interviews of others, and really deeply considering it, and then thinking how you might be able to apply this information. Would you say that sort of, well, one, that was sort of innate, part of your personality, and then two, that's been something that you actively sort of started to develop further, like, okay, well, this is a strength for me. I'm gonna dive into this. I'm gonna lean into this 100% along the way, and that's just sort of like also led to your pathway of where you've ended up right now. Would you say that's accurate, or?
Yeah, I definitely would. It's a combination of that, all of that, because for me, I've said this for a long time, that I believe that there's a blueprint of greatness, is what I like to call it.
Mm,
So in this process of wanting to figure out, or observe these patterns of expansion and contraction, you're going to start seeing patterns that work, and you're going to see the goats, the greats, and you're going to, and a lot of times when you see the sports channel, they're showing highlights. They're not talking about the process. They're not talking about the journey, right? The stuff behind the scenes when those people were training and doing all the tough work when no one was around, right? Except
mm,
for maybe a
mm,
coach and maybe some teammates.
yeah.
And so when you dig into that and you start to go, oh, wait, this person over here, even though he's perceived as this big showboater, he's actually a student. And that show that he's putting on is intentional, that he's completely scripted. And he's actually a journaler, and he actually meditates, and he actually does a lot of these other things that these other greats do. Right. And so I bring those together, and like I've used Kobe Bryant, the basketball goat, one of the goats, as a good archetype, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
his Mamba mentality, that he lived by. Rule number one is obsession is not an option, right? When you want to be great at something,
Mm,
a healthy version of obsession is necessary, because you got to fall in love with what you're doing. And when you fall in love, you're going to become curious, right? You're going to be vulnerable. You're going to be going through the process of learning. And so I naturally do that because I don't know any different, right?
right.
So I was not the kid over playing, games and running around with other kids my age. I was the kid that was sitting right next to the coach, asking him questions, and then sitting next to another coach and asking him questions and cross-referencing. That's always been my way. I don't think
Yeah.
that's the way, but that's my way.
Right.
And so, it makes sense to me now that I piece these together and I go, oh, wait, okay, I think we have something here, because I always feel like we're exploring this together. There's something
Yeah.
that organically is happening between me and each person.
Yeah.
And, I talk a lot about the flow state, being in the zone, optimal performance, that
Mm,
state. And what's interesting about that, is that it's uncomfortable to get into that, right?
mm,
It's like, I call it surfing the wave.
yeah.
It has to be a big wave that kind of has this sort of like, oh, here we go,
Yeah. Right.
And so I selfishly have to get into the flow state as much as they, right? So probably in your podcasts, right?
Yeah.
You have these great conversations when you're kind of uncomfortable too. Like, yeah, I know what I'd like to talk about, but I don't know exactly where this conversation is going to go.
Yeah.
So I'm the same way in coaching. Like, I know, what I'd like to talk about and what could be helpful, but there might be something that's a little more important that just sort of happens on its own. And we need to follow that.
It sounds like it's a degree of positioning, positioning yourself to get into that state, positioning yourself to take advantage of it as well once it does sort of like develop and come about. And this kind of leads me into the next segment and next question, actually, if we could here, Seth. And it's a Q&A discovery. We can just slide right into that right now and continue this back and forth. But I found this quote on your website, and I'm just going to read it off for you and, of course, for listeners. And it reads as follows: knowing who you are outside of performance increases your performance. And tell me about that. Good.
Yeah. Well, part of my story is that I did go on to achieve a lot. So I won the national championship and another, a number of the other things that you mentioned earlier. The part, and you asked a question earlier that I should answer, I think, a little more in depth. I didn't go to be what I am today, right? I had achieved a lot, and then I struggled with, okay, so I know who Seth the swimmer is, but I have no clue who Seth is, right? So I went through this transformative time. It was very, very difficult. Anyone who's been through it, it's like, it's like a rebirth after, like you have to have almost a death and then a rebirth. And so I started over. And when I had no choice, I started having debilitating panic attacks, right? So luckily I was, at the time I lived in Los Angeles, so I went to UCLA. They had a program for repeat exposure, which is a group, a situation where everyone's really supportive, and a lot of journaling, a lot of just talking through, trying to work through the triggers of fear. And, that was transformative. Wonderful people from all walks of life. We all came together to support each other in this small group. And it was a blessing, right? Every weakness becomes a blessing if you, go through the journey. At least that's my belief. And so what I learned from that experience of these debilitating panic attacks, like I couldn't get in the car and drive down the street without, full-blown panic attack, having to pull the car over, walk around the block for like 3 hours just to wear my system out, to get in the car and drive a little bit further. I mean, like very extreme. And so what I learned through going through the process of like, where is this coming from? It came from, my understanding of it was that it came from me trying to control things that were outside of my control. So when I was an athlete, I could control that, it seemed, right? And when I was done, I wanted to control life. And life has a way of, anytime you try to control it to some degree, it spins out of your control. And a panic is trying to control things that you can't control, and it just gets further and further away from you. So the blessing became that I had to let go. The only control you get is by accepting that you don't have control. So that became the blessing. So during the rebirth of becoming a parent and doing other things in life, I was around other parents, and I stayed in the same town as the university that I went to. And so some of them had been to the university, and they said, "Hey, are you the same Seth Pepper that's up on the wall, all these awards and records and stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, that's like a past life." Right. So then they asked me, "Well, what is it? Tell me." And so I told them, the versions that you were hearing earlier. And then when they heard that and all the wins and the losses, especially the losses and the rebirth, they said, "I think you could really go and help people." And so it was other parents at the school that really started to see the value even before I could see the value. And then once I started telling my story and working with people, and then, realizing, oh, wait, I got something here. I can actually help people to perform and go after their dreams and make them reality. Right. I just thought everyone thought like that.
Right, right, right,
And
right.
it wasn't the case. And so, yeah, that's kind of the reward.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's kind of a nice reflection on life. Like I like that point of, you know, there's certain things that we can control, and there's a ton that we can't, and it's recognizing that. But then also too, like that notion of the world that you lived in within the athletic side as well, being an area that you had a high degree of control in, and then
Yeah.
with life and everything that's thrown at us, yeah, it's those two worlds are juxtaposed constantly, and if you're bouncing in between them, it's probably not so difficult to have some of those worlds sort of like mix and sort of you mentally get confused between the two at times, right? Like I can control this aspect in this sphere, but over here you try to do so and you can't. You just can't,
Yeah.
right? And that creates some conflict there, no doubt. So,
Yeah.
um,
And the balance that you're working on, to go back to the quote that you were asking about, is that once you understand who you are outside of the performance, right?
yeah,
Then you create this counterbalance of, oh, okay. So, and this is what I always try to work with people on right away, and build a foundation based on it, is that you're a human being, not a human doing, right?
yeah, yeah,
And so human beings are allowed to fail. So we're going to embrace our failures, allow ourselves to be a human being first, and then the doing becomes intentional. Then we can say, I am choosing to do this. And that
mm,
changes everything. Because if you feel like you are the doing,
mm-hmm,
then what happens when the doing starts to move towards failure? Then all of a sudden
right,
your life's getting out of control, and then all of a sudden your identity,
yeah,
and on and on and on. And that's when, and that's usually where I start with people, is like
right.
they say, oh, one thing will go wrong, and then all of a sudden these thoughts and this conversation starts to happen, and then it's like off to the races, and it's like, oh, here we go again, you know because
The,
the identity is in the doing rather than the being.
right. These sessions that you have with these athletes or even, business leaders themselves, I'm sure it varies person to person based on their own skill development, mental mastery, all sorts of things. But generally, like, I mean, you're getting into some different areas here, like concepts and ways of thinking and deconstructing, reconstructing thoughts and ideas. Like, how involved is this with some of these athletes? Like, how long are you working with them, or is it indefinite? Like, maybe we could dive into the weeds just a little bit here in terms of that side of things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, for me, I want to be there and help them through, some transformative times. And so there is the progression of, where are they in the season? It could be, like with the golfer that I mentioned earlier, she just had back surgery,
Mm,
a couple of years before, was considering retirement. So, now she's considered this mentally, fierce warrior. And I
mm,
remember asking her, everyone has this perception of you. You're very intimidating, right?
mm,
How did we build that? How'd you build that? Right. She said, long conversations of crying and being myself, and, those sort. And,
mm,
to me, that just is fascinating. The process that we go through of being able to, go through a transition where you think that your livelihood is going to, be over, along with an identity. And
yeah,
then you go through the transformation of being more than that, the doing, and you build up this understanding of like, okay, well, I'm a human being, and I'm also really good at this craft.
yeah,
So the journey is one of those things that it's, you know yeah, I guess everyone's a little bit different. I like to, my coach was the Olympic coach. He was head of USA swimming as well eventually. So all
mm,
of Michael Phelps's 5 Olympics, and so he coached the best of the best. And I remember asking him, how, was there one personality type that you would say was the top performer,
mm,
type?
yeah,
And he said, if you could plot them like dots on a star map and draw a circle around them, right? All of my best athletes were always on the edge, but they were
mm,
all extremes of, whatever
yeah,
it was, extreme
yeah,
extrovert, introvert. And so
nice,
for me, in that speaks to, it's more of an art than it is a science. I was fortunate to have two really great coaches towards the end of my career, and one actually was a professional artist as well.
Okay.
And that artistry of the coaching was really, really key because he treated us all different, right?
Mm,
At times that was very frustrating because why isn't she training as hard as me?
yeah. Yeah.
That sort of comparison thing.
Yeah.
But then, eventually I had to accept and learn that everyone's
Recognize.
a little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the process is been fascinating to be able to, I don't know if I could put my finger on and say, it's this long. I get results quickly. I will say this. I tend to work with very intelligent, sensitive people. And I think the reason to that is probably because those sort of things are incredibly powerful tools, but they're also incredibly destructive tools when they're out of balance. So, that's what I tend to work with.
I imagine now too, like just based on your own accomplishment and probably your client list now too, you're probably at this point where you're selecting as much as like the clients are selecting you, you're kind of selecting who you'd like to work with that are people that you just said are going to be people that you could see that you could get quick results with. I'd imagine like just in reference to what you were saying, people are a bit different. Sorry.
Yeah. No, you bring up a good point. I to me, the flow state, everyone has an understanding that may be a little bit different. To me, the flow state comes out of a sense of urgency, right? And so when I feel like that person cares, that's the essential. I have to, obsession is, there's no, you just have to care about at least figuring it out. You may be in a transition of, I don't know if I care about this, but I might care about something else. That's fine. But be curious. And so, yes, if I'm falling asleep, it's probably because someone on the other end is just walking through the steps. And, that's what I like to make clear is that most of our relationships, whether we know it or not, are, like teachers, we're trying to get a good grade. Bosses, we're trying to get, a promotion. Maybe even our mates, we're trying to say the right things so we don't get in trouble, on and on. But in this relationship, I want to hear the truth. I want to hear, kind of what's really going on unfiltered. And so that's what I look for is the raw. I'm just so used to people going out to the battlefield and coming back with results. And I'm totally fine with this did not work at all whatsoever. Awesome, right? Because we're processing the feedback and we're going to find something that does, right?
Okay. I've got this next question here that I'm really curious to learn a little bit more about. And it involves, I guess, again, of course, mastering performance. And some of the clients that you do work with, lightly listen to those off, NFL, MLB, you've spoken already about this. I'd be curious to know whether or not like the approaches that you use for mental performance are broadly applied or based on a particular sport. For example, of course, like one sport is going to physically have different demands, but even at times too, might have different sort of mental demands as well, based on the pace and intensity of the actual sport and the way it's just played. Am I understanding anything there? Like, is that something, or do these techniques or these approaches broadly apply across the board?
There are a lot of broad applications and across the board where we all have to get clear on what what motivates us. So goals, short term, mid-term, and long term. All of us, when there's an opportunity, something's at stake, there's going to be pressure involved. So what's your relationship to failure? What's your relationship to success? And what's your relationship to pressure, right? Those sort of things, and appreciation of the flow, getting in the zone. But definitely every sport has a different feel to it. I mean, I work with someone that's going for the world record in lifting, the strongman, right? And so that has a level of intensity where it's one, very tiny moment of explosiveness.
Mm,
And then a golfer will take 4 days of 5 hours
right.
of competition each day. So that's 20 hours, right?
It's a
So
different type of mental demand, I would suspect, at least. I follow sports myself. I've
yeah,
played as well to a degree, and that sort of fascinates me as well. It's just what you're explaining right there, that there is that degree of variation, but also at the same time, like those things that you were just speaking about as well, like those do broadly apply. I'm curious, I guess, in terms of your sessions with these athletes, like to what degree, like what ratio are we looking at, generally speaking? Say broad sort of approaches down to these sort of like pinpointed, customized approaches based on the sport themselves. I don't know if you could break it down
yeah,
that simply,
definitely. Well, definitely. What's interesting about it, at least for me, is that I like to say we're not just working on your performance, skills. We're working on life skills.
yeah,
Um, so a lot of what we're actually working on, I'll encourage them to use them in everyday life because the pressure is lower, but it's still there. And so, for an instance, if they're driving age, when you drive, when someone cuts you off, right? How are you dealing with that? Are you, allowing that to get to you and change your mood, even though you have no control over that person and how they drive, right?
right.
And using those times in everyday life so that we can handle those situations better and focus on, okay, what do I have control over?
Mm-hmm.
And when you get that right, it could be simple things, making your bed in the morning, right? That's a great opportunity to actually perform positive self-talk. It's, also a time when you can actually create momentum, out of something that you actually control. And, from there, tying your shoes, brushing your teeth. These seem like little things, but actually, yeah, you're building up momentum throughout the day. And then when you are that top performer out there on the court, the course, the boardroom,
Mm-hmm.
it will, play out so that you can actually build off of that momentum from your everyday life into
Mm-hmm.
this peak performance space. And so I think that's what fascinates to me, because at first, when I first started, I probably would have started with this assumption that it's going to be a special, you know,
Yeah,
each person's going to be very different from each other,
right.
you know. And I would go on these podcasts and, I would tell my story, and then someone would contact me and they'd say, I just like the way you think. I like the way you talk. Could you work with me like you would work with an athlete? So that happened with Formula One racing. I was on a podcast for F1, and I had two different people. One was a business person, and the other in Norway, and then another person, and there was a Netflix film director.
Yeah,
And they both asked, will you coach me like you would coach an athlete?
yeah,
Let's do it.
yeah.
And so the business person, they went from the bottom of sales all the way to the top of sales, fastest growing tech company in Europe. They doubled second place, right?
Mm,
To the point
mm,
where now I've worked with him for years, and he's been offered a C-suite position of this company.
mm,
Because he's gone from being, as I like to say, you were the player when you were the salesperson, and
yeah,
now that you're C-suite, you're now the coach, right? So same, references to sports, and same thing with the Netflix film director.
mm,
Once we worked with, and I worked with him pre-production, production, so as he's on the set having
yeah,
sessions, and then post when they're editing and putting it out there and publicizing it, and here he has multiple millions of dollars at stake. And was he dealing with pressure?
yeah,
Right. And then when
yeah.
he makes pressure his friend versus something that, oh, I got to get this right, I have to be,
Eliminating.
perfect.
Yeah,
Then all of a sudden his world just shifted, and he was, I want more of this. There's
yeah.
more opportunity where there's more pressure. I want more of this. And the film came out, and it was number 2 on the planet for Netflix, number 2 on the planet. And I'd coached all of these people the same way, and we were all going through the human experience.
Yeah.
So
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. Like how do you not get pulled into this world even deeper. Like I could see it just being like this passion driven sort of like enterprise eventually for you, that like you seeing these results. I mean, getting these results for people, not only within the sports world you're speaking of, but now like transitioning into the business world as well. Yeah, it
Yeah.
must be. You feel like you're unlocking something there, obviously, and there has to be a certain degree of reward, in experiencing this, again and again and again. And obviously, in this journey, I'm sure too, you have clients that experience failure from time to time. So you already
Yeah.
referenced that and come back to the drawing board essentially, and like, okay, well, this approach wasn't working. All right, let's
Yeah.
figure out something that will work, and then eventually working through these issues and finding that level of success becomes your degree of success as well. I
Yeah.
can see it just being a highly, highly rewarding sort of journey that you're constantly on yourself.
It is. There's a level that that I've been described with humility. There's a humility to it though, right? If any at any time, if I think it just comes from me, then I think it becomes detached and it becomes about me. And it's not, it's about them. They are the warrior out in the battlefield. At the end of the day, they fought the battle. I'm here. I love the fact that I can help, right?
Yeah.
But I have to be honest that they're transparent,
Mm-hmm.
that it's not comfortable. It's almost like the lie detector is, if I get complacent, if I think that I have this wave figured out, then I get rigid and I'm no longer surfing that wave of the zone, the moment, the flow. And then the inspiration isn't there. And so I'm always, I don't know any other way, right?
Yeah.
It's real
Well,
for me. Like there's a
it's
sense of urgency like to
mm,
it. And that feeds the creativity, that feeds the next solution, because it's never really exactly the same, right?
yeah.
And I have clients that come back to me and say, that was good, but it's got to be different, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the golfer is a great example, because she I was sharing some successes with and going, oh, this person did this and this person did, Netflix director and this and this, and they're doing the same thing you're doing, thinking this was building up the confidence. But what it was doing for her and her personality was,
More
no,
pressure.
actually it's making this comparison, and this is before she had won, and I don't like the way it makes me feel, because I feel like I've let you down, or I've let myself down because I haven't
More
won yet.
pressure. She's piling on herself. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So she came up with this rule, and she said, I don't want to say the word win. Okay.
Mm,
And I don't want any comparisons to anyone. So please don't tell me about anyone else.
mm,
So I'm like, okay, we're working on winning, and I can't say the word, and I can't talk about anyone else's
mm,
success.
mm.
Okay, game
You got to
on. Let's
reinvent
go.
your game a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and we did it, right? We did it
Yeah.
that way without using the word win, and no comparisons. It's just being, for her, locked into what she was doing, oblivious to the other scores, and just working on, as you started the show with, mastery, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
trying to get
Well,
better about her craft.
yeah, yeah. I like that point they raised of this humbleness towards your craft and what you're doing. I think that speaks to this growth mindset, and you've already referenced this. Like, yourself, you don't have the answers to everything always, right? But
Yeah.
you're constantly growing, you're constantly evolving and just being exposed to, I'm sure, all these different types of people, who somebody you were just mentioning right there. Like, you're picking up different approaches, different ways of interpreting the world, and then taking a little bit from here, maybe a little bit from this past client, and then repackaging it up to make it apply perhaps for this individual who has need A, B, and C. And yeah, I could see how that would be rewarding as well. How you're constantly evolving yourself and growing, and adding to your own base knowledge as well. So
Yes.
yeah,
I have to. I have to.
I bet. I bet. Yeah, we're just flying through this call or through this talk. I've got like a million more questions. I just don't think we're going to get to them all. But I do want to get into this water cooler story segment, and maybe we go with a brief sort of version of something that is representative. You've already shared a few different stories already, but is there anything else meaningful that stood out over the course of your career that you'd like to share?
Well, okay. I can't say, I'm not going to cuss. But it involves it involves the F word, right? So I'm
All
just
right.
going to say F. No, I'm not going to say the word.
Okay. All
Um,
right.
okay, so I had been second my sophomore year, so my 6th year of swimming. And then I had been second my my third year of college, so my junior year. So I'd been second twice in the nation.
All right.
And then my senior year. So this is it. Final race of my college career. And I remember saying, just something snapped inside me. And I just said, F it all, right? F this race, F these people, F all of it, right? And my aunt, who had never seen me compete, she's a nurse from New York City, never been to a swim meet. She just said, I knew you had won just by how you stood so solid behind the start.
Yeah.
And it was this transition. And, I dove in the water and I almost broke the American record by 1 inch. And I was going so fast, all the timing of the turns and everything was off. It was like this other gear that I didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
And my coach he had been a great champion as well, world champion and gold medals and all that. And he used to say when I was getting second, he'd like, why are you apologizing for your greatness? And I was like, what? I'm out here busting my butt. I train harder than, what is he talking about? Right. Yeah. And then when that switch went off, I call it the F it switch, right? Like that's what he was talking about. And so the realization, these 2 switches from second place to champion, was breaking the rules, basically. And the rules were inside of me. They weren't outside of me, right? I was the one that had those rules. And when I said F it all, I broke all the rules. And so when that golfer won, I was just telling you about, that hadn't won in 12 years in their entire career as a professional, that's what I told her that story. And I said, tomorrow, F it all, right? And that's what we called it, the F it switch, right? And so that's what I try to do for people is, let's break all those rules, our rules inside that hold you down, and go to the other side. Let's see what's on the other side.
Yeah, I love it. I can see how, like, you're working me up here, Seth. Like I'm ready to go out and no, but I can see this. Like joking aside, like sometimes it's these simple sort of like revelations that people need. It strikes me as, like the skill, obviously, like some of the people that you're working with is obviously inherently there. And it's managing what's up top, it's just breaking through and just finding ways to like deconstruct some of these like thoughts that aren't helping that person achieve. And then once you can sort of like at least identify what those barriers are, then that's when like the magic starts to happen. And like in your story, and then with that golfer herself too. I mean, it's really quite fascinating, like how just it's this oftentimes that can really like break through and allow for high levels of success to occur.
Yeah, it is. And it really is that simple. I like to say, power hides in the obvious, right? It's right there. It's as simple as your breath, right? Just like a nutritionist might say, hydrate, just drink water. It's free. At least it used to be free, right? Like it's so simple, and it's the most essential thing that you need to do. So it's right there.
All right. Well, maybe we could transition to this last segment here really quickly. And it is, hinged on the future, crystal ball segment, trends, predictions, so on and so forth, what we're typically looking at here. And to this point, like we focused a lot on just, sort of like cerebral sort of thoughts and working oneself through emotions and whatnot. Be curious about moving forward in terms of the industry that you're working within, technology. I don't know how much you're utilizing or leveraging that. Is there any like chatter within the industry in terms of, improving performance with athletes, ones that you work with perhaps, or even within business as well, involving technology at all?
Technology has been interesting. The heart is such a great source of inspiration. So, mindfulness, as you brought up earlier, of being able to meditate. I think the being able to monitor your system, in real time, I think is really powerful. So, whether they're using a Whoop, there's all kinds of the Aura Ring. There's the watch, where you can actually just see your vitals live. I think that's can be really transformative for people when they can actually sit and be quiet for a moment and see the effects in real time. That's a big deal. I think in the space in general, whether it's a technology, like a tool that you use, or like a physical tool, or it's just the appreciation. I think right now mental health is becoming such a big concern across the board, where I think that there's a nexus, there's a crossover between mental performance and then also mental health. And so that's what I've intentionally done, in my approach, because I know that if you don't understand that you're a human being first and a human doing second, and you choose to do, then we're going to have mental health issues later. And so I think that that's the technology that I think is really key, is we're starting to see like people and organizations and companies really say, okay, we need to take care of our people, right? And when I get up and, when I make presentations, I did it with business school just recently, and I get up and I go, okay, I'm just going to take you through a session. Like, we kind of went through some of these subjects together today. I'll have someone that says, a business leader say, I want you to talk to my leadership. I want you to, and I'm going to use sports as a reference, right? Yeah. It's just a good metaphor, and whether you're an athlete or not. And so we can start to talk about mental health issues and at the same time, mental performance issues, and hopefully help people to find their, as Joseph Campbell calls it, find their bliss, in that flow state, and go into failure, go into pressure, right?
Yeah. Fascinating stuff, Seth, I must say. I feel like this talk is just literally blown by, and I've just felt raptured by it all, and I'm sure listeners will as well. So I've got to thank you. I think we are drawing to a close here, but thanks so much for taking some time and joining the show today. It's been a really, really insightful talk.
Thank you. I appreciate the space and the conversation. It's been really amazing.
Yeah, great. Well, for those interested in learning more about Seth and his work, you can check him out on LinkedIn, Instagram, and of course at his website, sethpepper.com. And for reference, all this information will be included in the show notes. Also, if you like today's show, please be sure to share. I mean, that stuff helps. It helps tremendously. You can rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And head on over to YouTube. In the last year, I did launch a channel over there which hosts the video conversations. And the cool thing there is we'll have some imagery associated with the talk, so you can kind of take it in a different manner. And of course, don't forget to tune into the next episode of Life as a, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Till next time, stay curious about life and living.